In today's video, we're going to explore the little town or pueblo of Pijao. It's located about 22 kilometers as the crow flies, and which is about 14 miles. But it takes about 2 hours to get there. Now, in comparison, Pereira is 31 kilometers as the crow flies, and depending on where you're stopping, it's 30 to 40 minutes. In today's video, I'm going to narrate 6 different stories, so you might want to stay tuned until the end. Now, Pijao was founded in 1899, but the story behind it's rather interesting. In 1899, a civil war broke out in Colombia. It was called the Thousands Day War. The war was between the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party. And it was similar to the Civil War in the United States in that it was an argument over the government. The Liberal Party wanted a central government. They wanted the power all centralized and everybody answered to the central government. And the Conservative Party wanted more of a federation where all the departments would actually have their own model of government, and that the federal government would simply be more of a coordinating effect. Well, this war went on for 3 years. The Liberal Party acted more like guerrillas. They were a small faction as compared to the rest of the country. And they tried to take over Bucaramanga, and they didn't succeed. And they were seen as guerrillas or terrorists. And a group of them escaped being captured and ended up settling in Pijao, which there were no roads to get there. It was, who's going to chase after them? It was kind of the main reason they went there. So Pijao was actually settled by terrorist guerrillas of the Liberal Party that came out of a 3-year civil war in Colombia. And it was a pretty serious time. There was probably around 150,000 people died, which was the worst war in Colombia's history. It was worse than their liberation. So this was a pretty serious time, and a lot came out of that. And to this day, the bitterness between the liberals and the conservatives exist. It's never been put to rest, and we're seeing it played out even now in presidential elections. It took 10 years to build the road into Pijao, and that was in 1938 the road opened. So from 28 to 38 they were building that road, and that portion of the road I believe is only about 7 kilometers, 3 or 4 miles, but that's the bulk of the journey. And even today with the road, that's the bulk of the journey. Now, we just came out of La Nina, which meant a lot of rain, more than usual. And that rain devastated this winding mountain road. And as I was driving through, there were at least 2 dozen, and honestly, I lost count. I'm trying to drive at the same time. And there were at least 2 dozen places where this road had washed out. Sitting here for about an hour, a piece of equipment went off the road, and so the road is shut until they get it out of the ditch. As I came through, most of the devastation had already been corrected. But as you'll see as I'm driving through, all the areas where they're in process of repair or have been repaired, it could be a pretty dangerous road at times. Finally, after a pretty harrowing drive, I got to the hotel that I was going to be staying. I reserved on booking.com, is called Victoria. It's an old house, and it's just recently been converted. So it's got a number of rooms. It was nice. Had hot showers, so that was good. And here we have it on the corner. Now, I checked in, and they didn't have a credit card the way Booking.com said, but I was able to transfer money from my bank to the Nexigo account. Now, you probably don't know what that is, but it's something that's very effective here. So I got all checked in. Everything was fine, and threw my backpack on the bed and headed out. But let's get to this meeting with Luz. Later I came back, talked to her, we chatted here and there, but the next morning, breakfast is included, and I was the only person staying here. You know, she was more like I was visiting friends. You know, what do you want for breakfast? Oh, eggs. Okay, how do you want them? She kept offering things, but she was also scolding me on the way about you don't want sugar in your coffee, and you should eat more yogurt, and she, which is really funny because there's always yogurt in my refrigerator, and I actually eat quite a bit, but you have to smile. It was like, actually it was kind of like meeting your grandmother. It was that kind of a thing. But what was most interesting about this was we talked for about 45 minutes. Now, she didn't speak a word of English, and I get to practice now and then, but this, I think, was the longest actual conversation I've had since I've been here. I have conversations here or there, but for just sit down and have one period of conversation, we talked about all kinds of things, about pre-COVID, post-COVID, about work ethics and how it's changed in Pijao and in Colombia. Talked about her relatives that have been to the United States. We talked about all kinds of things, politics and religion, a lot about Pijao itself. So she was a very nice lady. It was a pleasant stay. Nothing fancy, but then again, not very expensive. Couldn't argue with the location. But I got to practice my Spanish in a deeper way than I usually get to practice. Usually it's more superficial. And this we had quite the conversation about some pretty good topics. And so I really appreciated the stay there. So I walked down to Central. Like it had been 4 years since I've been there, so I was kind of curious. It looks almost identical. Almost nothing has changed, even some of the same people I recognized. But it was time to grab some lunch. I didn't have breakfast. I usually don't. But the coffee that I had that morning was kind of aciding my stomach a little bit. So it's time to have lunch. It's about 1:30, I believe. So I walk around. I look for a place to have lunch and found it and sat down. And I got the almuerzo. And it was crazy delicious. Almuerzos tend to be somewhat tasteless or ho-hum or just average. I mean, nothing exciting. This was really flavorful. So that was fine. So I went out walking. I decided to get a coffee at a place that I had coffee 4 years ago. It was very good. I bought some coffee, brought it back, did the same thing this time around, and talked to the owner for a while. We had a nice conversation for about 10 minutes maybe. And so that was nice, but it was more of the superficial type of conversation. You know, the pleasantries that you exchange and a few things. Told him I'd been there 4 years ago, and you know, that kind of thing. And then later that night, I went back for dinner, and I chose a different place. I sat down, and on the menu, I ordered something, and well, we don't have that. So I ordered something else, and we don't have that. And the cerdo, or the pork, nothing. You know, it's like, okay, I'll have the ribs. No, there's no ribs, and it's like there wasn't really much of anything. They had no beef, no hamburger, no steak, no. It was it was almost nothing. And so I said, well, what can I order? And she said that she could make some like pork chop, but she would have to run to somewhere else to get it. And I said, well, okay, fine. You know, I kind of wanted dinner. And she did. She ran somewhere else, came back about 15 minutes later, and they cooked it up and brought it out to me. So I asked why. I mean, this was not a small place. This actually had maybe 30 or 40 tables. I sat outside. Why don't you have anything on the menu? Well, it's a combination between the road being washed out, which is what I thought it was entirely, and also it was the bridge south of Quindío department had collapsed, and they've been rebuilding it. And apparently, that's like the only major route for that part of Colombia, this little two-lane bridge. And that's where food deliveries would go. So a combination of washed out bad roads and a collapsed bridge was causing everything to dry up. And the only thing that they had were the things that they do locally. Now, Pijao is somewhat self-sufficient. Luz was showing me all the fruit trees and vegetables around that the community, they don't really belong to anybody in particular. You just decide to go get what you want to get. And I saw that in my walk around. So they don't really have a food issue amongst themselves. But if you go to a restaurant, you're ordering off the menu, it was certainly problematic. The bridge is opening, I believe, today or Monday, as I'm making this video. And that'll all clear up. Plus, they've made great progress on the road. The last worst part of that road was where I was, where the equipment was a backhoe. It was a big backhoe. Caught some loose ground and fell down into a ravine. And it took a couple hours to winch it up out of there. Well, that was the last of the worst of it. And so as we drove through, you could see all the repairs, and they were still working on things. So that was, that was really the interesting thing about the food there, something that just never occurred to me.
Okay, ¿con dulce o no dulce? Dulce y uno. Con gusto. Sí, hay molido y grano. Grano. Ok, compre. Ok, después. Ok, con gusto. Gracias.
So here I'm going to skip around a little bit. I'm going to talk about when I was going to sleep. And I was pretty tired, and the bed was comfortable. And I'm trying to sleep, and I ended up awake most of the night. There was one mosquito, and it was one of those things. I got up, I don't know how many times, turned the lights on, tried to find that sucker. And I'd lay back down, I'd just start to fall asleep, and he'd manage to get up around my ear and wake me up. And I'd get up again, and I'd try to find him and kill him. That went on for about, 4 or 5 hours. I finally fell asleep, and then I woke up, and I had a damn mosquito bite. In case you haven't figured it out, this little town, this pueblo, is very isolated. As I was waiting for my dinner, as I had to run and find something, there were these two girls that were walking around the Central Park. And they walked around and around and around. And I counted 12 times and gave up counting. They walked from daylight into dark. And it was pretty fascinating because I grew up in a small area. And I remember there isn't necessarily much to do. and so this is what they do. You know, they walked around and around in circles, talking to each other. And then when it got late, they went home. I just found it kind of interesting. What do you do in a small town? These girls are probably about 18, 19, something like that. So I equate the entertainment myself. I had my own personal dog protectors, and they were awesome. At any given time, there were 4 of them, 2 on one side, 2 on the other. But they changed up from time to time. Different dogs would come in. There was one, it's like, I just want to take them home. But the thing is, they have owners. It's just such a small town, they let them wander around, forage for food or whatever. So why did I need dog protectors? There's this guy that would go around begging, but he was obviously not in his right mind. And I'd see him go around, he'd get me chased off from here or there. He was kind of an annoyance to the local people. And he came up, typical, you know, scruffy, hadn't washed his hair, scrawny. Now, he came up and just stared at me, never asked me for anything, but he stood back about 30 feet and just stared. He folded his hands in front of him. Well, it's kind of freaky when you're trying to eat to have somebody just staring. I was getting kind of annoyed, but he took one step towards me, and these dogs came running towards my table and out to him, and they were viciously, savagely barking and growling, and it's like they're going to tear him apart if he took one step more. He took a step back, and they ran over and laid down on either side of me. He took another step forward, repeat, growling, savagely barking, and just gnashing of the teeth. I mean, they looked vicious. And he took a step back, and he laughed, and they come running back and laid down either side of me. So he went walking around, and he was behind me, and he was staring. He took a step towards me. Dogs, same again, growling and barking, and there was another table nearby, and they were kind of laughing about it. And he took off, and one last time he tried again around the front of me, and he tried to come in, and the dogs went to town. I didn't see them do this with anybody else. Before this happened, I was walking around trying to pick a place I was going to eat. And then afterwards, as I was walking around a little bit before I head back to my room, didn't do it with anybody else. I have no idea why they chose me. But these dogs, not only were the 4 protecting me, but there were several others that worked in shifts. Now I sat there and I had a beer, had my dinner, and I took my time. I was probably there an hour and a half maybe. I wasn't in a hurry. I was observing what was going on. And, I wish I had some video of the 2 girls, because if you saw it, you would understand why I wanted to tell about it. But without having the video, it probably comes up as a non-story. But believe me, it was a story. Kind of had to be there, right? So those are my dog protectors. And the next morning, I was telling Luz about this one dog. It was just gorgeous dog, German Shepherd, probably not a puppy anymore, but not an adult, maybe 6-8 months old. And I really wanted that dog. And she said, well, somebody probably be upset because not only do people own the dogs, but the dogs are almost community property on top of that. And I noticed that as I was, watching, observing earlier during the day, that they would, come up to like a restaurant and somebody from the town would toss them something to eat, and then they go to another one, the same thing. I didn't give them anything to eat until I was pretty much done and I was leaving. They'd served up more than I wanted to eat, and so I cut it up into a number of pieces. I think I had something like 12 pieces, and I would just like 1 inch by 1 inch, and I would just start tossing these off to the dogs before I left. So rather than get scrapped, they got it. But you know, through that hour and a half that I was sitting there, they weren't even begging me for food, which was kind of surprising. But so that was my story of my protecting dogs. There's not much more to say about my adventure in Pijao. I'd been there 4 years before. I try not to repeat videos, but it's been quite a while. I was very curious about the pre-COVID, post-COVID. What I'll say mostly in difference is when I was there before, there were some tourists, like a couple. There was nothing, and there was a lot less people out walking around. It had an effect, and it's hard to put my finger on it, but I think people are somewhat withdrawn. And my conversation with Luz, I brought that up, and she concurred that it affected people, and she felt they were less social, where before everything was 100% social in the community, and now some people tend to keep to themselves at least some of the time. And that's a sad state of events, and we're a few years down the road. But that's how those things happen, I guess. So that was Pijao. It's an interesting little town. It's worth a little trip. But don't expect much going on there. You might be chased by a mosquito, watch a couple girls walk aimlessly around, and meet some doggy friends. See you next time.